Don't ever touch the Black Christian communion line. What if I told you the communion table you sit at was designed in Africa, marked with a GS cross? It is not hidden because your pastor rejects it, but because modern pulpits have completely erased your ancestral lineage from the cup. Today, that silence ends. You are about to discover the oldest illustrated Christian manuscript on earth, containing a visual receipt they never wanted you to see. Inside the Garima Gospels, the disciples surrounding the table do not look like the paintings on Western church walls. They are dark-skinned. You must open your eyes to this truth right now. Think about what the communion table represents to you in your daily walk. For generations, the Western system has trained us to view this cup as a quiet, passive memory. They stripped the liturgy of its physical reality, replacing the African theological roots with a smoothed-over European framework. But when you lift that cup, you are not engaging in a disconnected ceremony. You are stepping into an ancient connection that they never showed you in seminary classes, a lineage that connects you to the kings of Axum, who took this same covenant with their lives. We must examine this table again through the manuscript receipts, reclaiming the legal authority of our fathers. Let us look directly at the ancient receipt preserved for over 1,500 years. In the dry mountain cliffs of Ethiopia, inside the isolated Abba Garima monastery, lies the Garima Gospels. This is the oldest illustrated Christian book in existence, carbon dated back to the 5th century. It is not a modern reconstruction, but a physical witness that survived the rise and fall of empires. While Europe was entering its dark ages, African scribes were painting the scenes of the New Testament with rich pigments. When they illustrated the Eucharistic table, they did not paint the pale faces that modern theology normalized. They painted the real skin of their people. Look closely at the disciples gathered around that table in the Garima Gospels illustrations. They are depicted as darker-skinned disciples, sitting in a sacred circle of authority. In the center of the table sits a prominent chalice, marked clearly with a Ge'ez cross. This is the seal of the covenant, an African validation of the promise that is passed down to you. The Western theologians want you to believe that African Christianity was a late import. But this manuscript proves the sacred cup was held in dark hands long before Rome exported its edited translations. This is the uncompromised receipt of your priesthood. When you sit in quiet libraries studying ancient liturgies, you quickly discover a heavy, uncomfortable silence. I remember examining dust-covered shelves containing facsimile copies of forgotten manuscripts that mainstream history simply left behind. You trace the Greek and Ge'ez letters, and you begin to realize that the history we have been handed is not incomplete by accident, but arguably redacted by design. There is a specific peace in those rooms, but it is mixed with a growing indignation. You realize that the very people who structured the early church and defined the boundaries of the faith were not European scholars sitting in cold stone universities, but African theologians writing under the heat of the sun. Yet this foundational reality is completely missing from the standard seminary curriculum. Why is it that the seminary curriculum completely skips the African theological giants when discussing the sacraments? For decades, our leaders have been sent to schools that teach them to ignore the Ge'ez manuscripts and skip the Coptic records. We are taught to look to Rome and Wittenberg for liturgical authority, leaving our own ancestral history buried in the dust. Perhaps this was done to maintain a specific hierarchy, or maybe it was simply a product of academic bias that could not allow a dark-skinned lineage to hold the key to the covenant. This systematic omission has left us with silent tables where the true power of the sacrament is rarely explained. We take the bread and we drink the wine, but we do so without the legal weight that our ancestors fought to preserve. This silence has created a tragic contrast between the modern quietism of our churches and the raw covenant power that the early liturgy actually holds. Today, we sit at silent tables, taking communion as a passive memory rather than an active legal claim. The early African fathers understood the Eucharist as a binding contract, a spiritual shield that protected the community from imperial oppression and demonic attack. In some sense, we have traded a lion for a lamb, reducing a mighty covenant into a harmless Sunday tradition. We must sit with this realization, looking at what was lost when the Western Church compressed the sacred rites, and we must ask ourselves how we can reclaim that original authority. We must honestly admit that the Western compression of these prayers was not just a matter of saving time. When Rome took control of the liturgical narrative, they shortened the extensive, power-filled ancient prayers that had been whispered in Alexandria and Axum. They replaced the deep, legal covenant formulas with shorter, more sterile statements. This was arguably done under the guise of liturgical safety, making the service predictable and easy to control. But in doing so, they stripped the liturgy of its raw, activating power. We have to confess that by accepting these truncated forms, we have participated in the silencing of our own legacy. This process of theological smoothing was design-heavy and highly effective. The Western systems did not just translate the ancient texts, they actively edited them to remove the prominent names of the African Church Fathers. The names of Cyril, Athanasius, and Mark were quietly dropped from the standard consecration prayers. By removing these names, the editors could pretend that the theological lineage of the Church flowed solely through European channels. It is a painful realization, but we must acknowledge that our modern pastors have been trained in this compressed tradition, completely unaware of the structural cover-up. As we examine this historical compression, we see how it served to isolate the diaspora from its roots. Perhaps we didn't realize how deep the censorship went, or maybe we assumed the translations were always faithful. But the manuscript evidence shows that the expansive prayers of the early church were systematically reduced to keep the congregation passive. This admission is the first step toward reclaiming our authority. We can no longer tolerate this theological smoothing that has cut us off from the legal seal of our ancestors. Let me speak directly to you, my brother and sister, as you prepare for your Sunday communion this week. When you walk into your church and take that small cracker and that tiny cup, you are not just participating in a simple routine. You need to understand that the cup in your hand represents an unbroken line of spiritual authority that stretches back 1,700 years. The Western system wants you to see it as a symbolic gesture of memory, a quiet moment of reflection. But the original manuscripts tell a completely different story. That cup is a legal title deed, a covenant seal that was signed and defended by African theologians long before modern empires existed. You are not a guest at someone else's table. You are the rightful owner of this ancestral lineage. Every time you take the elements, you are activating a covenant that was painted in the Garima Gospels and prayed in the Axumite liturgy. This is your true inheritance, an unbroken line that no imperial decree could ever erase. When you take communion this Sunday, I want you to look at that cup differently. It is not a Western symbol of quietism, but an African seal of authority and protection. You must take it with the boldness of a chosen people, knowing exactly who stood before you. We are bridging the gap between historical suppression and your present household reality. Your family needs to know that this is not a foreign religion handed to you by slave masters, but a sacred legacy that belonged to your ancestors first. In some sense, reclaiming the cup is reclaiming your identity. When you drink this Sunday, you are declaring your place in that ancient, unbroken chain. Let us take this truth back to our homes, and let us prepare to dive deeper into the visual witness of the manuscripts. To understand this unbroken chain, we must travel to the mountain peaks of northern Ethiopia. Here, perched on a high volcanic plateau, sits the ancient Abba Garima Monastery, founded in the late 5th century by one of the 9 saints who fled Rome's religious persecution. For centuries, the outside world believed that early Christian illustrations only existed in Rome's catacombs or Byzantine archives. They assumed that African Christianity had no early visual records, or at least nothing that predated the medieval period. However, in the late 20th century, researchers finally began to look closely at two manuscripts kept in the monastery's treasury. What they uncovered would arguably shake the foundation of Western biblical scholarship. These manuscripts, known as the Garima Gospels, had been guarded by the monks for over 1,500 years, hidden away from the prying eyes of colonial collectors who wanted to control the narrative of Scripture. We trace this discovery to show you that the roots of your faith were physically preserved in the very land they tried to write out of history. For decades, Western academics dismissed the monks' claims about the age of the Garima Gospels. They asserted that such detailed, colorful illustrations could not possibly date back to the 5th century. They labeled it a 10th or 11th century creation, trying to minimize its historical weight and push its origin closer to European influence. But in 2010, the Oxford Radiocarbon Accelerator Unit conducted independent dating of the parchment itself. The results sent shockwaves through the academic world. The tests confirmed that the manuscripts were created between the years 390 and 650 AD, matching the era of the Aksumite Empire. This carbon dating officially made the Garima Gospels the oldest illustrated Christian book in existence. It proved that African scribes were producing high-quality illustrated Bibles with complex pigments and Ge'ez text, long before Europe developed its own manuscript traditions or began exporting its edited versions to the rest of the world. The preservation of these texts in the mountain monastery is nothing short of a miracle. The monks of Abba Garima protected these sacred pages through wars, Islamic invasions, and Italian occupations. The monks hid them in dark caves and mountain crevices whenever imperial forces threatened their valleys. Perhaps this intense preservation was fueled by the knowledge that these Bibles held the true visual lineage of the apostles and the sacred covenants. As you look at the dry, rugged cliffs surrounding the monastery, you realize that this was not a place of isolation, but a fortress of preservation. The dry mountain climate and the absolute devotion of the guardians ensured that the original pigment and the Ge'ez text remained intact. They kept these receipts safe for 15 centuries, waiting for this exact moment to reveal the truth to a generation of Black Christians who are finally ready to listen. When you turn the ancient pages of the Garima Gospels, the first thing that hits you is the color. Inside the Eusebian canons, which are the liturgical tables structuring the 4 Gospels, we find detailed portraits of the evangelists and the disciples. The artists did not use white paint for their skin. Instead, using local ancient pigments, they created rich, dark-skinned figures with prominent African features. These are not faded pigments that darkened over time, but intentional choices made by artists who drew their community. This visual witness is arguably the oldest representation of the disciples in existence, providing a clear proof that contradicts centuries of European whitewashing. It is likely that these artists painted what they saw in their local congregations, preserving the true physical image of the early church. Now, contrast these 6th century illustrations with the modern European portraits you see hanging in churches today. For hundreds of years, the Western system has flooded our minds with images of a pale, blue-eyed Christ surrounded by European disciples. We were trained to accept these paintings as historical truth, ignoring the fact that they were created during the Renaissance to serve political power. But the Garima Gospels stand as an uncompromised receipt. They show us that long before the Renaissance, and long before Rome began defining theological art, the oldest Bibles depicted the followers of Christ as dark-skinned figures. This is not a modern political stance, but a historical reality preserved in the dry mountain air of Ethiopia. By looking at these dark-skinned figures, we are forced to dismantle the colonial lies. Perhaps we were told that art in the early church was uniform, or maybe we assumed that the oldest manuscripts had no illustrations. But the Eusebian canons prove otherwise. The existence of these portraits in the oldest illustrated Bible demonstrates that the early church recognized and celebrated the African presence at the very center of the gospel story. This is the visual proof that validates your identity. You are not looking at a European legacy that you adopted, but an African legacy that was stolen, and is now being returned to you. But the most crucial illustration is the depiction of the Eucharistic table. When you reconstruct the drawing of the communion table in the Garima Gospels, you notice a highly specific layout. In the center of the table, surrounded by the disciples, sits a large centered chalice. The artist did not leave this cup blank. Painted clearly on the side of the chalice is a distinct Ge'ez cross. This is not a generic Roman cross, but the ancient African seal of covenant and authority. It is possibly the oldest illustrated chalice in any Christian manuscript, and it sits at the absolute center of the table, showing that the covenant was anchored in African liturgy from the very beginning. The presence of this Ge'ez cross on the centered chalice carries immense theological weight. In the ancient world, a seal on a cup was not decorative, it was a legal signature. It identified the authority under which the covenant was established and celebrated. By placing the Ge'ez cross at the center of the Eucharistic table, the 6th century scribes were declaring that the communion line was legally bound to the African lineage. This cup was not an import from Rome, but a native vessel of power, consecrated under the authority of the African fathers who guarded the Orthodox faith. We must realize that this seal has never been broken, even if it has been hidden from our pulpits. When you sit at your communion table this Sunday, you need to remember this centered chalice. You are not drinking from a cup of passive submission, but from a vessel of legal authority marked with the Ge'ez cross. This is the seal of your ancestors, a receipt that connects your local church to the volcanic plateaus of Axum. In some sense, every time you take communion, you are reaffirming your place in that ancient, unbroken inheritance. This is the manuscript receipt that protects you, and tonight we are going to trace how that liturgical power was spoken aloud in the early church. Many people assume that our modern communion service is the direct, unchanged descendant of the early church's practice. Most churchgoers sit in their pews believing that the simple prayers spoken by their pastors have always been the standard format of Christian worship. But if you compare this common assumption with the Coptic liturgical manuscripts of Egypt, the contrast is stark and immediate. The dry sands of Egypt have preserved the Sahidic Coptic and Bohairic translations of the earliest Eucharistic liturgies, guarding them from imperial editing. These are not late medieval developments, but ancient liturgical witnesses that trace their roots back to the 2nd and 3rd centuries. When we look at these documents, we realize that the common, simplified communion ritual we practice today is a late compression, lacking the legal depth and the explicit covenant activations found in these early African records. We must ask ourselves why these expansive prayers were shortened and why our pulpits keep them silent. Let us cite the Coptic manuscripts directly. The Liturgy of St. Mark, preserved in both the Sahidic Coptic and the later Bohairic manuscript traditions, contains Eucharistic prayers that are incredibly extensive, detailed, and legally precise. Unlike the modern Western service that focuses on a brief moment of silent remembrance, the Coptic liturgy is a formal, legal activation of the covenant between God and his people. Scribes translated these prayers into the local dialects of Egypt to ensure that the congregation understood the exact legal terms of their inheritance and protection. In contrast to the common view that early liturgy was simple and unorganized, these texts show a highly structured, legally binding ceremony that was spoken aloud. They detail the exact blessings, the protection of the community, and the invocation of the Holy Spirit, proving that the early African church understood the table as a source of raw, sovereign power. The most astonishing realization is that these Coptic texts predate the liturgies of the West by centuries. Mainstream history often presents Rome as the source of liturgical structure, but the manuscript evidence proves otherwise. The Sahidic Coptic records demonstrate that the theological framework of the Eucharistic table was fully formed in Africa, while Rome was still struggling to establish its own theological identity. This is a critical receipt. It shows that your communion cup is connected to a lineage of liturgical power that arguably predates Western systems entirely. Perhaps we have been looking in the wrong direction for our spiritual heritage. Or maybe we have been settling for a compressed copy, when the original, African authenticated receipt is fully available to us. By understanding this, we begin to see that our Sunday morning communion has a deep African receipt that cannot be erased. I want you to sit with this image, a dark-skinned congregation gathered in the early Coptic Church of Alexandria, chanting the divine liturgy in unison. For generations, this community maintained an unbroken oral tradition that matched the written manuscripts word for word. They did not treat the Eucharistic service as a casual gathering, but as a solemn legal assembly where the covenant was activated through spoken words. When you listen to the rhythmic chants of the Coptic liturgy today, you are hearing the echo of the 2nd century church, preserved in its purest, most raw form. We must sit with the reality that this oral tradition was a shield against imperial editing, keeping the apostolic pattern alive through centuries of colonial pressure. Why did they place such an emphasis on this unbroken oral tradition? The early Coptic Church understood that the vocalization of the prayers held an active power. The divine liturgy was not just a text to be read, but a vocal rite that had to be delivered with absolute precision. By chanting the prayers, they ensured that the theological lineage was passed down to every generation, uncorrupted by foreign translators. Perhaps this was their way of guarding the legal force of the covenant, or maybe they simply understood that some truths are too heavy to be left solely on parchment. Either way, they preserved the original apostolic pattern with a devotion that should make us question our modern, casual approach to worship. This vocal rite carried immense legal force in the early church. The Alexandrian theologians understood that when the priest spoke the words of consecration, a formal, spiritual contract was signed in the presence of witnesses. It was not a symbolic memory, but a binding declaration that unlocked protection and inheritance for the community. We trace this vocal pattern to show you that the early church did not practice a passive, silent communion. They engaged in a vocal, legal action that had to be heard to be activated. By sitting with this historical truth, we begin to realize how much power we have surrendered by accepting the quiet, simplified versions of the sacrament. Now look at the contrast between this ancient African power and the common view taught by Western theologians today. For centuries, Western academies have promoted a compressed version of communion, reducing it to a brief, symbolic snack at the end of the service. They have systematically stripped the liturgy of its legal and spiritual weight, leaving congregations with a hollow ritual that holds no active authority. This liturgical erosion was not accidental. By shortening the prayers and removing the names of the African fathers, Western theologians could control the theological narrative and make the congregation dependent on imperial structures. It is a slow, quiet erosion that has left our pulpits silent and our tables empty of their true power. This liturgical erosion has severed modern congregations from their forgotten roots. When you examine the history of the Western compression, you see how the expansive prayers of the early church were systematically edited to remove the covenant activations. The Western theologians replaced the legal formulas with simple, commemorative phrases, effectively turning a title deed into a mere memory. This compression has left us with a form of godliness that denies its power, keeping us from claiming the full authority of the sacrament. But the manuscript evidence stands as an indictment of this Western system. It proves that your communion cup has a lineage that predates this erosion by centuries, and it invites you to look beyond the Western edits. I invite you to re-examine your Sunday understanding of the communion table. When you take the elements this Sunday, look past the Western compression and look toward your forgotten roots. The bread and the cup are not symbols of passive quietism, but the legal title deeds of your ancestral lineage, authenticated by the Coptic Church. In some sense, reclaiming the cup is reclaiming your place in that ancient, unbroken priesthood. This is the truth that has been hidden from your seminary classes. And tonight, we are going to look at the Aksumite liturgy, where these covenants were officially written into the legal records of the kingdom.
I still remember the rain falling outside the British Library in the autumn of 2018, when I sat in a quiet research desk surrounded by catalog manuscripts. During that 2018 research trip, I had requested access to the Ethiopic collections, specifically looking for early liturgical records.
When the staff brought out the protective boxes containing the Ge'ez scrolls and codices, I felt a deep sense of reverence. You look at these ancient vellum pages, written in the beautiful Ge'ez script, and you realize you are looking at something that survived centuries of colonial editing. Holding those records, I realized that the narrative of church history I had been taught in Western schools was not just incomplete, but arguably redacted to hide our inheritance. As I began to translate the Ge'ez scrolls, the feeling was indescribable. You read these prayers that were penned by African hands in the 4th century, and you realize that this is not a dry academic text, but a living voice. The rhythm of the prayers was different from the European liturgies. It was expansive, poetic, and carried a legal weight that felt almost tangible. In some sense, reading the Aksumite liturgy in that library was like hearing a message from a long-lost family member. It was a visual and textual confirmation that our relationship with God did not begin with the slave trade, but was fully established in the oldest Christian kingdoms. I want to connect this ancient Ge'ez text directly to you, my brother and sister, sitting in your home today. The words that I read under the lights of the library were not meant for scholars alone. They were written for you, to serve as a legal receipt of your identity and your relationship with the Creator. When we study the Ge'ez scrolls, we are not looking at a museum piece, but at the title deeds of our lineage. It is a powerful realization that perhaps we have been fighting our battles without our most potent shield, simply because we did not know our ancestors had already written our names into the legal records. We must honestly admit that our modern pulpits have failed us by staying silent about the exact prayers that structured the early church. We have to confess that we have been taking communion under a simplified, edited format, completely unaware of the legal power that was stripped from the service. When you examine the Aksumite liturgy, you discover a specific prayer called the anaphora of the apostles. This is not a vague, general memory of Christ's death, but a legally binding Eucharistic prayer that was spoken aloud to consecrate the bread and the cup. It is a painful realization, but we must acknowledge that our ignorance of this text has kept us from claiming the full authority of our inheritance. What makes the anaphora of the apostles so revolutionary is that it explicitly named ancestors who were the theological guardians of the faith. Unlike the Western liturgies that genericized the saints, the Aksumite liturgy named Cyril, Athanasius, and Mark of Alexandria as the direct lineage through which the cup was passed. The early African church understood that in a legal covenant, you must identify your predecessors to validate your own authority. They did not leave their lineage to chance. They wrote it directly into the consecration prayers. By naming these ancestors, they established a chain of custody that proved the legitimacy of their priesthood. We have to confess the vital importance of naming your ancestors aloud. In the biblical world, a name spoken is a covenant claimed. When the Aksumite priests called upon the names of the Coptic fathers, they were not just reciting history, they were activating the legal protections and the promises bound to those names. Perhaps we have been struggling because we have forgotten to speak the names of our theological fathers at the table. Tonight, we admit this omission, and we must prepare to reclaim the legal force of the consecration prayer that has been preserved in the Ethiopian mountain monasteries. You need to understand, my brother, that the consecration prayer is not a poetic request. It is a legal activation of a covenant. When you examine the legal language inside the anaphora of the apostles, you see that the words are structured like a formal contract. Scribes did not use vague metaphors. They defined the terms of exchange. In this early African rite, the bread and the cup are treated as physical tokens of a binding agreement. It is likely that when the early Christians took these elements, they understood they were participating in a sovereign covenant activation that held legal force in both the spiritual and physical realms. This was not a passive remembrance, but a formal declaration. Think about this clearly. The early church fathers saw the bread and the cup as spiritual title deeds. You are not just taking a snack, you are claiming a legal seal of protection and inheritance. In the ancient world, when you took the bread under a specific consecration prayer, you were receiving the deed to the promises of God. The chalice was the seal that authenticated your authority as a chosen heir. This means that your Sunday communion is a formal legal action, a covenant activation that demands your full ownership. Western theology has taught you to view it as a quiet, emotional moment. But the manuscripts show that it is a legal transaction that secures your household. You must stop approaching the table like a spiritual orphan begging for crumbs. Look at the legal seal on the cup. It is the signature of your lineage, the receipt that proves your name is written in the covenant. In some sense, we have been taking communion without unlocking its true legal force, because we have forgotten the contract terms. We must read the anaphora of the apostles with the understanding that we are executing a formal covenant action. It is time to lift the cup with the boldness of a legal heir who knows exactly what the contract guarantees. Why has there been a systemic suppression of these African liturgical receipts? Mainstream denominations have remained absolutely silent about the Aksumite liturgy in the Garima Gospels. This silence is not accidental. If the church system admitted that the oldest illustrated Bible and the early liturgies were fully formed in Africa, they would have to surrender their theological control. They would have to acknowledge that the foundational covenants and the priesthood were held in dark hands. To maintain their authority, they compressed the sacred rites and edited out the African fathers, keeping you in a state of spiritual dependence. We must warn you that this ignorance of your receipts keeps you from your true power. When you do not know the legal terms of your communion, you cannot claim its protection. The system uses theological control to keep you passive, teaching you a version of Christianity that celebrates your submission rather than your authority. But the manuscript evidence stands as a key that unlocks your heritage. It is potentially the most dangerous truth to the modern theological establishment because it returns the covenant to its rightful owners. We must refuse to stay in the dark, and we must recognize that the silence on these receipts is a tool of control. It is time for you to claim your space. You can no longer allow modern pulpits to dictate the boundaries of your faith. The Aksumite liturgy proves that you have a 1700-year receipt that protects your table. Reclaiming this cup is the first step toward reclaiming your identity as a chosen people. Perhaps the system will continue to ignore these manuscripts, or maybe they will try to explain them away. But the physical witness is in your hands tonight. Walk into your inheritance, claim your space at the table, and prepare to examine the Roman connection that Western history tried to sever. Let us sit with this realization as we examine the 3rd century Roman records. When you sit in the quiet study rooms looking at the documents attributed to Hippolytus of Rome, you trace a text known as the Apostolic Tradition. This document is arguably the oldest surviving record of Roman liturgical practice, dating back to the early 200s AD. You look at the translation, and you begin to feel a strange familiarity. It is not the compressed Sunday service we are used to in the West. Instead, it describes a solemn, structured Eucharist, where the prayers are extensive and the covenants are defined with absolute precision. We must sit with this text and ask why the modern church has moved so far from this early pattern. As you read the details of this early Roman record, you notice the solemn structure of the early Eucharist. Scribes documented the exact prayers spoken by the bishop over the bread and the cup, emphasizing the legal nature of the consecration. There are no casual additions or modern theatrical elements. The service was a sober, formal transaction, designed to bind the congregation to the promises of the Messiah. It is likely that this structure was not unique to Rome, but was a reflection of a shared practice recognized across the ancient world. The early church did not treat communion as a quick symbolic afterthought, but as the central legal seal of their community. But the most astonishing realization comes when you compare this 3rd century Roman record with the Gai's manuscripts of the Aksumite liturgy. As you sit with the texts side by side, you trace the sentence structure and the covenant formulas, and you realize they match almost perfectly. The prayers of Hippolytus do not represent a separate, superior European tradition. Instead, they preserve the exact same legal pattern found in the African sands. This means that before Rome compressed the liturgy, the early church had a shared understanding of the Eucharistic power, fully aligned with the African lineage. Perhaps we have been taught to see Rome as the originator, when it was simply copying the pattern established by our ancestors. Many people assume early Roman Christianity developed in isolation from the churches of Africa. Modern pulpits often present church history as if the theological center of gravity was always in Europe, with Rome acting as the sole guardian of apostolic truth. But if you compare the Roman apostolic tradition with the Aksumite liturgy, the contrast is immediate. The apostolic text of Hippolytus matches the African Eucharistic prayer almost word for word in its core sections. This is not a coincidence, but proof of shared roots. It demonstrates that the early church had a single, unified pattern practiced from Rome to Axum. By comparing these texts, we expose the common lie of European theological exceptionalism. This shared pattern was not developed in Rome, but was historically anchored in Alexandria. The Coptic Church of Egypt was the intellectual and theological engine of the early Christian world. When Hippolytus compiled the Eucharistic prayer, he was not inventing a Roman liturgy, but documenting the Alexandrian pattern passed down through the Coptic fathers. It is likely that the Roman Church adopted this structure because they recognized the legal and spiritual authority of the African lineage. In contrast to the common view that Africa adopted Roman traditions, the manuscript evidence shows that Rome drew from the deep theological wells of Africa to structure its worship. This is a critical receipt. By understanding these shared roots, we begin to see the unified timeline of the covenant. The apostolic text is not a Western possession, but a shared receipt that connects the diaspora to the early church. Perhaps the Western theological system wanted to hide this connection because it destroys their monopoly on spiritual authority, but the manuscript evidence stands as an uncompromised witness. When you take the cup this Sunday, you are not engaging in a late Western development, but in a global apostolic pattern that was anchored in Alexandria and preserved in the Gaia's scrolls. Let us hold this truth, and let us examine how the Western system began its imperial compression. The turning point in liturgical history began when Rome sought to consolidate political power over the empire. As the Roman state merged with the ecclesiastical structure, a wave of imperial editing began. The emperors and their chosen bishops wanted a standardized, easy-to-control liturgy that could be quickly recited. They viewed the extensive, legally binding prayers of Alexandria and Axum as too long and politically dangerous, because those prayers emphasized local sovereignty and divine covenants. Consequently, they introduced liturgical changes that shortened the services, reducing the deep, contract-like consecrations to a few simple sentences. This was arguably a calculated move to weaken the spiritual authority of local congregations. We must analyze how these liturgical changes systematically dismantled the legal covenants. The early African prayers were structured as formal title deeds, with specific sections invoking blessings, protection, and the legal transfer of authority. By compressing these sections, Rome effectively removed the legal terms of the agreement. They turned an active covenant activation into a passive commemorative memory. It is likely that this compression served to make the congregation more submissive to imperial authority, as they were no longer claiming their specific, legally documented promises. The original mandate was replaced by a standardized, shortened text that severed the table from its native power. However, the older, uncompressed text of Hippolytus, which matches the Aksumite liturgy, demonstrates that the older tradition holds the true authority. This means that your communion line has a legal foundation that predates Rome's imperial editing. Perhaps the system wanted to keep you from realizing this, or maybe they assumed the original texts were lost. But the vellum scrolls do not lie. The expansive prayers of our ancestors are the original mandate, and they carry a spiritual weight that no imperial decree could ever erase. When we reclaim these older texts, we reclaim the legal authority that was stripped from our tables. This historical connection between early Rome and Alexandria is vital for the modern diaspora connection. When you understand that the earliest Roman liturgy matched the African pattern, you realize that the timeline of our covenant has never been broken. The Western theological system wants you to believe that your faith was handed to you by your oppressors, that the Bible is a European book, and that communion is a Western tradition. But this connection proves that the theological center was always African. The timeline of the covenant was fully established and documented by dark-skinned theologians long before the Western Church began its liturgical editing. This is a critical receipt that binds the diaspora to the original apostolic line. You must recognize that your communion is an ancient shield, a sacred legacy that has been preserved for your protection. The extensive prayers of the Aksumite and early Roman liturgies were designed to invoke a real active protection over the community and their households. It was not a passive ceremony, but a spiritual contract that activated the blessings of the chosen people. This means that when you take the cup, you are not just remembering a past event, you are claiming a legal shield that protects your family from spiritual and physical harm. Reclaiming this covenant timeline is potentially the most powerful action you can take to secure your household. We are bridging this historical text directly to your modern Sunday morning experience. When you take the bread and the cup this Sunday, remember the shared roots of Rome and Alexandria. Look past the compressed Western prayers and claim the full legal authority of your ancestral lineage. The cup is not a symbol of submission, but a vessel of covenant power that belongs to you. Let us carry this understanding to our tables, and let us prepare to look at the great Alexandrian fathers who fought to defend this very line. I want you to look closely at the theological foundation of your faith, my brother. When we discuss the early church councils and the definition of who Christ was, the name Cyril of Alexandria stands at the absolute peak. Cyril of Alexandria was not a European scholar. He was a dark-skinned African patriarch who ruled the church from the ancient metropolis of Egypt. His writings and his theological defense of the Incarnation laid the groundwork for everything we believe today. Yet, when you sit in modern pulpits, you are rarely told that this giant of the faith belonged to your ancestral lineage. You need to claim his legacy as your own, because Cyril was not writing for a European empire. He was writing to defend the truth of the scripture. Cyril's most powerful work was his theological defense of the Eucharistic unity. He argued that the bread and the cup were not mere symbols, but the physical convergence of the divine and the human, establishing a real, legally binding covenant. He fought against heretics who tried to divide Christ, asserting that the Eucharist was a single, indivisible source of life and protection. You need to understand that this defense was structured as a legal argument, designed to secure the church's inheritance. It is likely that Cyril drew his understanding of covenant legal force from the Coptic fathers who came before him. He was not introducing a foreign philosophy, but systemizing the native African understanding of spiritual contracts. When you study Cyril's letters, you see clearly that he wrote in the African tradition of liturgical depth. He did not seek to compress the prayers or make them acceptable to imperial Roman taste. Instead, he maintained the extensive, detailed petitions that celebrated the sovereign power of God. This is the lineage you inherit when you lift the cup. It is a lineage of theological defense, of intellectual giantism, and of absolute covenant fidelity. In some sense, we are reclaiming Cyril's voice tonight to show you that the intellectual center of the early church was never in Rome, but in the dark hands of the Coptic fathers who stood firm against the empire. We must honestly admit that our understanding of the guardians of the faith has been severely distorted by Western academic bias. We have to confess that we have been taught to view Athanasius and Mark of Alexandria as distant, Europeanized historical figures, rather than our dark-skinned theological ancestors. When we examine the history of Egypt, we see that Athanasius, the great defender of the Trinity, was nicknamed the Black Dwarf by his imperial enemies because of his dark skin and short stature. And Mark of Alexandria, the writer of the earliest African gospel, was the founder of the Coptic Church. These were the true guardians of the sacred cup, and we must acknowledge that their erasure from our modern theology is a major loss. These guardians of the sacred cup stood firm against imperial attempts to corrupt the liturgy. Athanasius was exiled 5 times by Roman emperors because he refused to align the church with imperial decrees. He and Mark of Alexandria guarded the Eucharistic prayers from theological dilution, ensuring that the legal covenant formulas remained uncompromised. It is likely that they understood that if the empire could edit the prayers, they could control the congregation's spiritual authority. They kept the liturgy pure, protecting the legal terms of the covenant so that they could be passed down to you. We must confess that their sacrifice is the reason your communion table still holds its legal weight tonight. Their legacy is officially documented and celebrated in the Aksumite liturgy. The anaphora of the apostles explicitly names Athanasius and Mark as the guardians of the priesthood, establishing their place in the unbroken covenant chain. Perhaps we have been struggling because we have neglected this legal chain of custody. Or maybe we assumed our communion was disconnected from their fight. But the manuscript evidence forces us to admit that our cup is legally anchored to their victory. Let us claim this lineage aloud, and let us prepare to look at how this history was systematically erased by the Western academic establishment. We must expose the European monopoly on church history that has dominated our education for centuries. Mainstream history books and seminary courses are designed to project a singular image of the early church, as if every major theological development happened in Rome, Athens, or Constantinople. This academic whitewashing has been highly effective in creating a false narrative of spiritual authority. They teach us about the European councils, but they systematically ignore the African councils that actually defined the core doctrines of the faith. By reframing church history to exclude the African continent, they have made us believe we are latecomers to the table, guests who should be grateful for a copy of their translations. But the manuscript evidence tells a completely different story. The foundational theologians who defended the Incarnation and structured the liturgies were Coptic and Ethiopic fathers. These dark-skinned giants of the faith were not minor figures, but the primary leaders of the early Christian world. Their writing is your covenant shield, a document that proves your lineage was at the center of the kingdom from the beginning. When you read the arguments of Cyril and Athanasius, you are not reading foreign theology. You are reading the legal defenses written by your ancestors. This is potentially the most suppressed receipt in modern theology, because it shatters the European monopoly on divine authority. This systemic erasure was not just about control of history, but control of your identity. If the Western system can convince you that your spiritual roots are European, they can keep you in a state of passive submission. But when you reclaim the writings of the Coptic fathers, you activate a legal shield that protects your house. You realize that your communion table is not a modern Western invention, but an ancient African legacy that was signed in Egypt and Axum. Perhaps the academies will continue their academic whitewashing, or maybe they will try to minimize these facts. But the physical manuscripts stand as an uncompromised witness that validates your authority. Let us have a personal conversation, just between you and me.
I look at our communities today and I see a tragic amount of self-censorship. Many Black Christians feel a silent hesitation when they talk about their ancestral identity, as if claiming their biblical legacy is somehow divisive or dangerous.
We have been trained to ask for permission to exist in our own faith, waiting for Western scholars to validate our presence. But tonight, I want to speak directly to that fear. You do not need anyone's permission to claim your fathers. The manuscript receipts are in your hands, and the legal chain of custody has already been established by the blood of the guardians. We must break the pulpit silence that has kept our churches in the dark. For too long, our pastors have stood before us reciting compressed Western liturgies, completely silent about the African lineage of the cup. This pulpit silence has left our congregations spiritually vulnerable, taking communion as a simple memory rather than a legal seal of protection. I want to encourage you to stop asking for permission from seminaries that edited your ancestors out of the curriculum. It is time to look at the GES codices and the Coptic liturgies for yourself. And it is time to speak the names of your fathers aloud at the table. Your family needs to hear this truth. Tonight, let us declare that the silence on African fathers is officially over. We will no longer accept a compressed liturgy that strips our communion table of its legal power. When you take the cup this Sunday, you take it with the full knowledge of Cyril, Athanasius, and Mark. You stand as the rightful heir to an unbroken covenant chain that was painted in the Garima Gospels. This is your legacy, and in some sense, claiming it aloud is the ultimate act of spiritual warfare. Let us walk covered, let us walk named, and let us prepare to look at how we reclaim this 1700-year sacred line in our daily lives.
I must stand before you tonight and admit my past mistakes. For years I taught and believed that communion was purely a symbolic gesture, a quiet moment of memory with no active legal force. I stood in front of congregations telling people that the bread and the cup were just visual aid, designed to help us remember Christ's death. I fell for the Western narrative that stripped the sacrament of their spiritual power, reducing a mighty covenant transactions into a simple emotional ritual. This admission is not easy, but we must acknowledge when we have been misled by standard theological training. We have to confess that we accepted this simplified view without examining the order received. Why did I hold that view for so long?
It was a direct result of seminary bias. Our theological institutions are heavily invested in promoting the Western liturgical timeline, which claims that the liturgy developed solely through Rome and European traditions. We were trained to look past the Coptic and Ethiopic records, treating them as Eastern anomalies with no relevance to our modern worship. This bias taught us that the English translation limit was the absolute boundary of biblical truth, preventing us from looking at the GES codices and Coptic manuscripts. It is likely that this systematic training was designed to keep us blind to our own lineage, making us depend on a compressed, edited liturgy. But the turning point came when the GES text forced a complete reevaluation of my theology. When I sat with the Aksumite liturgy and saw the legal, contract-like structure of the prayers, my seminary bias was shattered. I realized that the early African church did not practice a symbolic, quiet communion. They practiced a vocal, legal activation of the covenant that was signed in the skin of the disciples. Perhaps I was slow to realize this, or maybe I was holding on to my standard training out of comfort. But the manuscript evidence forced me to admit that my past teachings were incomplete. We can no longer tolerate the English translation limit when the original African receipt is fully available to us. Many people assume that the oldest Christian traditions are European, believing that Rome holds the key to the apostolic lineage. But if you compare this common assumption with the history of the Aksumite liturgy, the contrast is stark. The Aksumite liturgy, developed in the ancient kingdom of Aksum in the 4th century, contains Eucharistic prayers that have been used continuously for 1700 years. This is not a speculative reconstruction, but an unbroken covenant that has been preserved in the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition. In contrast to the common view that early African faith was unorganized, these GES scrolls show a highly structured, legally binding liturgy that predates modern Western systems by centuries. By examining this, we expose the European monopoly on church history. We must trace the use of this liturgy inside the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition to understand its weight. The Ethiopic scribes did not compile these prayers for academic study. They chanted them in their congregations as an active shield of protection. The Aksumite liturgy preserves the names of the Coptic fathers, establishing a legal chain of custody that connects the modern table to the early apostolic lineage. It is likely that this unbroken covenant was protected by the isolated mountain monasteries, specifically to guard it from foreign edicts. This means that when you examine these prayers, you are looking at your oldest communion receipt, a legal document that proves your lineage has always been at the center of the covenant. Let us compare this ancient African receipt with the simplified communion service we see in modern Western churches. The Western system reduced the sacrament to a brief memory, but the Aksumite liturgy presents it as a formal covenant activation. Perhaps the mainstream pulpits wanted to hide this receipt because it returns the spiritual authority to dark hands. But the manuscript evidence stands as a key that unlocks your heritage. When you take communion this Sunday, look past the common compressed prayers and claim the legal seal of the Aksumite liturgy. This is your true inheritance, an unbroken covenant chain that protects your household. Let us hold this truth as we prepare to look at the climax of the table. To understand the legal anchor of your communion table, we must look at how Cyril and Athanasius defended the faith. In the 4th and 5th centuries, the Roman Empire tried to dictate theology, issuing decrees that diluted the legal power of the sacraments. These imperial rulers wanted a compliant church with a simplified liturgy that they could control. But Athanasius stood firm, going into exile 5 times rather than surrendering the authority of the apostolic line. And Cyril fought at the Council of Ephesus, writing extensive defenses of the Eucharistic unity. They were defending truth, not as an abstract concept, but as a legal shield for the chosen people. This means that their victory protected your communion line from being completely erased by the Western system. Their victory ensured that the original consecration formulas were preserved. When Cyril and Athanasius successfully fought the imperial decrees, they protected the exact legal covenants spoken over the bread and the cup. If they had failed, the communion service would have been reduced to a simple imperial ceremony. But because they stood firm, the liturgy retained its contract-like precision. It is likely that they understood that the spiritual protection of the congregation depended on maintaining these legal boundaries. By defending this truth, they preserved a line of custody that stretches directly to your local church, ensuring that the covenant remains active and legally binding tonight. This historical defense demonstrates that your Sunday table is legally anchored. You are not taking communion under the authority of a modern denomination or a local pastor, but under the authority of Cyril and Athanasius, who signed the vellum codices with their lives. Perhaps the Western system wants you to remain ignorant of this anchor, or maybe they want you to believe your table has no legal backing. But the manuscript receipts show that your cup is backed by the highest theological victories of the early church. When you understand this anchor, you can no longer approach the table with hesitation, but with the boldness of a legal heir. We have reached the climax of this journey, the declaration of what the communion table actually is. I declare to you tonight that the bread and the cup are not symbols, but the covenant title deeds of your inheritance. In the biblical world, when you took the bread under a consecrated prayer, you were receiving the deed to the promises of God. The cup was the Eucharistic seal that validated your legal status as a chosen people. This means that your communion table is a court of law, a place where you execute a formal contract that secures your life. You are potentially holding the title deeds to divine protection, wealth transfer, and spiritual authority every time you take the cup. You need to realize that this Eucharistic seal unlocks wealth, health, and spiritual protection for your household. The early African fathers understood that communion was a legal shield against demonic forces and imperial oppression. They did not teach it as a passive routine, but as a dynamic activation of covenant power. When you drink the cup with this understanding, you are activating the legal terms that guarantee your victory. It is likely that the system has hidden this seal because a congregation that knows its legal rights cannot be controlled. We must claim this power tonight, refusing to let our tables remain silent or symbolic. I call the African diaspora in America and across the world. Claim it now. Stand up this Sunday and take the cup with absolute power. You are not a guest begging for crumbs. You are the rightful heir to the 1700-year Aksumite covenant. Speak the names of Cyril, Athanasius, and Mark at your table. Teach your family that the chalice with the Gez cross belongs to them. In some sense, taking the cup with this knowledge is the ultimate act of reclaiming your identity. Reclaim your lineage, claim your title deeds, and let us prepare to close this record with a solemn prayer of humility and power. As we prepare to close this journey, I want to speak directly to you in a spirit of humility. What we have examined tonight represents one reading of church history, a perspective anchored in the ancient African manuscript receipts that mainstream institutions have left behind. It is not my intention to dictate how you practice your faith or to tell you to abandon your local congregation. The Christian tradition is vast, and there are many historical interpretations of the sacraments. I simply want to present this evidence so that you can study for yourself, comparing the Coptic and Ge'ez records with the standard English translations. It is likely that this research will open new doors for your understanding, but you must always weigh these truths with wisdom and discernment. We must remember that the historical debates on liturgy have been ongoing for centuries. The early church fathers themselves spent decades debating the exact format and legal terms of the consecration prayers. This means that we should not expect our modern pastors to have all the answers immediately. I encourage you to take these Ge'ez and Coptic receipts to your pastors and study them together. Examine the illustrations of the Garima Gospels and the prayers of the Aksumite liturgy as a community. Perhaps they will be surprised by the depth of the African lineage, or maybe they will welcome the opportunity to dive deeper into the original manuscripts. Either way, this study is a tool for your growth, not a source of division. Take what serves your spiritual walk and leave what does not. Let us sit with this truth as we go to the Father in prayer. I ask you to join me in a moment of quiet, solemn connection as we claim this sacred legacy. Father, we thank you for preserving these manuscript receipts through the centuries. It is likely that your hand guided the preservation of these scrolls in the mountain caves of Ethiopia. We thank you for the devotion of the Coptic and Ethiopic scribes who protected the true image of the table. I pray for a deep spiritual boldness to fill everyone listening tonight, that they may take their communion table with power. We ask for your divine protection over truth seekers who are reclaiming their ancestral lineage. Let this cup be a shield of fire around their households, unlocking health, wealth, and spiritual authority in their daily lives. We ask these things in faith, knowing that you are the keeper of the covenant. Perhaps this is the moment of our true restoration. As we stand at the end of this revelation, I invite you to make a formal claim of your identity. If you are ready to claim this ancestral lineage and walk in the legal authority of the cup, I want you to leave the keyword parousia in the comments below, followed by your city. This is our word for holy boldness, a sign that the silence on our lineage is broken. Therefore, never forget that this cup is your legal shield. I invite you to subscribe to this channel and comment Amen to claim your inheritance. Walk in truth. You are free. The content presented by Dark Logic is for educational and historical exploration purposes only. The views expressed represent one perspective on church history and do not constitute absolute theological, spiritual, or legal advice. Viewers are encouraged to conduct their own research and exercise personal discernment.